The following video is part of the Northern California Training Academy and Casey Family Program's Crisis Communication and Preparation video series. This series is designed to walk child welfare leaders through steps to take in order to be prepared before an incident occurs, including the development of a crisis communication plan, working within a political environment, and creating a narrative that promotes successful solutions that will improve the safety and well-being of children and families in care.
What I'm going to say here is not rocket science, but in order to create stabilization in any organization, we must stabilize individual staff. It has to happen. And one of the problems is that some of us are not really equipped to do that, or there's so much going on externally, there's so much politic happening after an incident that, in fact, it becomes secondary, not because we don't love and care about our staff, it's because we're too overwhelmed and we haven't slept in a number of days, right? And we're trying to mediate what's going on outside. We're trying to mediate what's going on politically. We're trying to mediate what's going on with the officials in the county as they're calling us, what's happening, why. So part of what I'm going to talk about is how it is that we can go focus back on individual staff as a way of stabilizing the organization, and how to stabilize the organization as a way of actually stabilizing individual staff. It's interrelated. I like to call this the elephant in the organization, but I think we used to call it the elephant in the room. There is an elephant in every room after there's been a critical incident. I have worked for agencies for years, public safety. After critical incidences, I was at the Northridge earthquake. Right after it happened, starting to work with public safety. Here on campus, what we do, actually, police and fire and the EAP work very closely right after any kind of traumatic event has occurred. And we hit the first responders immediately. We're there the next day starting to talk about it. With the fire chief, with the police chief, who were the responders, how are they affected, how's everything going? Let's talk about next steps so that we can reduce some of what I'm going to call the elephant in the room, which is secondary trauma. Secondary trauma is the elephant in every social service agency today, and some people talk about it, we hear about it, we know it exists, but we don't necessarily know what to do with it. And it affects us as individuals, and it greatly affects an organization when staff specifically have been traumatized. So for the sake of any re-education, I'll apologize, but let me just define it. It's stress resulting from helping or wanting to help traumatized or suffering individuals. So who does that include? That includes most helpers. That includes social workers, obviously. That includes nurses, psychologists, clinicians. That includes doctors. It includes first responders, police, fire, air traffic controllers. It includes anyone that is in the process of trying to assist and ends up wearing down from the assistance and the stress of it. Sometimes it's called compassion fatigue. Sometimes it's called vicarious traumatization. But there's something else that I like in terms of expanding the definition of secondary trauma. And it's expanded to this. It also is as a result of us witnessing over and over life events that are traumatic. In this case, children, which I don't know about you, but that just adds to the level of trauma. You know, I worked with fire agencies, and I did research with fire agencies for a number of years. One thing that they would always talk about was when there had been a fire or an incident, like a car crash where children were involved. It did them in. And I would talk to the firefighters, and they macho to each other, and they would go in a room with me, and they would cry about the effect it had on them, that they had to, sweep up a child off of the ground on the freeway. And I used to go to some of those. I would drive with them day after day, and it was terrible. It was terrible. So we know specifically that witnessing life's events are difficult, but also witnessing life's injustices, watching organizational issues that are dysfunctional or are frustrating or don't feel validating also can start spurring and increase secondary trauma. And quite often we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that it's not just the work with the clients, but it also can be the organization itself that can create and enhance and spur on trauma. So these are just some of the impacts. The impact of secondary trauma is quite similar to post-traumatic stress. So post-traumatic stress disorder is where you see people begin to feel hypervigilant. There's a vigilance. There's almost an inability to quiet down your own nervous system. So we see sleep impacted. We see people that start to really have trouble functioning. They are always complain of exhaustion. They just feel physically, they feel mentally exhausted. We see they talk about intrusive thoughts. They can't sleep because they can't stop thinking about things that have occurred as a result of an incident. What did they do? What could they have done better? Did they make an error? Should they have done something else? Why didn't they know? Why didn't they know? There's sort of these issues that come up. There's something also that comes up as a psychological impact, which I think is important, a personal impact, and that is eventually you get real cynical. That there's a cynicism. Do you guys know gallows humor? You know gallows humor? That's an old statement. Gallows humor is really just dark humor. It's that dark humor where you actually find things funny that are really not funny at all. If you come to my office on a Tuesday morning, because we have case management on Tuesday morning, there's 10 of us, 10 clinicians, we have such gallows humor. I look at us, I think to myself, we need to retire soon because it's getting worse as the years are unfolding. And it's not that we're cold. Actually, we're very warm. It's that the humor actually kind of lets some of the air out. Do you ever find this? Where you need to actually let some of the air out, so some of the humor. But part of that is the cynicism that starts growing as a result of secondary trauma. It's kind of interesting because by the time I finished up just creating this PowerPoint, and I've talked on these topics for many, many years, I realized how secondarily traumatized I am. So if anybody can give me an hour after this, I would really appreciate that because I'm realizing I was at jury duty the other day, last week, and part of also what I do, I'm a violence prevention expert. So, which is really just another statement for saying that it really is really dark because we assess whoever might be dangerous on campus to make sure that the place stays safe. And so I'm a professional threat assessor, and that's part of my job. And so we kind of follow people who are and try to assess who could possibly come in and shoot up the place, like avoid a Virginia Tech or avoid a Colorado and that sort of thing. So the judge says to me, and I'm sitting in the jury because, of course, I got called. Out of 60 of us, they say, Beth Cohen. I'm like, of course. And I go up, and the judge says to me, is there any reason that you would have difficulty being able to stay impartial and being able to stay even-minded about this burglary case where this horrible man, but I didn't say that to him, horrible man went in and he not only did he steal from one house, but he found their summer house keys and he went to their summer house. I thought that was pretty industrious, actually. And the defense attorney is asking me questions, and the judge is asking me questions, and we get to the point of that. Not only did I go to law school, which should have just let me go home, they didn't. That then I go into that I'm a professional threat assessor, and I'm not sure whether that would impact my impartiality. And so the judge asks me a question, and he says, well, after all, this is a whole different case. I said, yes, but I've grown very cynical. I'm very cynical. The man spent 10 minutes talking to me about cynicism. And I was fascinated because, you know what? The judge was very cynical. And I realized that he, too, was burned out. And I was almost tempted to ask him to go to lunch because he was so cynical. But the point being is that it happens and it sneaks up on us, and we don't necessarily know it's happening. We don't know it's happening, but it happens. Some of the professional are obvious. We start to lose our productivity. We notice an impact. We notice an impact in our job satisfaction, if it was there before the incident happened. And we start to notice that we start to question ourselves and our own professionalism. Have you ever felt that way? Oh my goodness, all of a sudden after 20 years, 15 years, 30 years, I'm questioning whether I'm competent professionally. But all of that can happen as a result of critical incidences and secondary trauma if it gets triggered. If it gets triggered. And many times we don't know. We just oh yeah, well, I'm just questioning myself, it's good. But sometimes these are actually the symptoms that are statements for you to know and statements for your staff to understand that this is what's going on for them. And of course, we get moving on. So after every time on this campus, after there's been a critical incident, we get people flooding in and they want to leave. They want to leave. They don't want to be here anymore. And people who, maybe a month or two later were actually enjoying their job. They want to leave. And one reason that we see such high turnover in social services, I believe, and the research is showing it, is as a result of unresolved secondary trauma. Have you noticed turnover? People want to leave. People do leave, right? They leave. And part of that is unresolved secondary trauma. Of course, we have organizational impacts. Turnover, turnover, turnover. How many of you had the experience where there's enough turnover that each time there's turnover, it then unbalances the organization? You have to start again, right? You have to try to create a team again. People have to come in. You have to build trust with them. Are they trustworthy? Aren't they trustworthy? It's a bigger issue than most people even realize in terms of the amount of turnover and how it dislodges and disorganizes an organization. Of course, once you have turnover, then you have increased workloads. So people who are already a little freaked out about the critical incidences are now overworked even more and afraid they might make an error. So that's a problem. Then you have this compromised continuity of care. All of a sudden, you're not feeling like you're doing as good a job as you could because, your number of cases just increased by a certain percentage. And of course, another organizational impact is we start to see organizational mistrust. With low morale, with some team erosion, but we start to see an increased or organizational mistrust, which can be a big problem. So I'm going to segue into neurobiology for a moment. And you're going to say, how did we get here? But we can get here because I want to be able to explain what actually happens in the brain that creates secondary traumas, that creates trauma itself. You're going to see this from the children you've worked with, and you're going to understand as well what happens to your staff. And I think, or I'm hoping, that understanding what happens to your staff might assist in terms of how it is that you can address some of these issues and who you need to come into your organizations post a crisis, post an incident, that can also help you address. Because leaders can address some of it, and they can't address other parts of it. Largely because someone was mentioning earlier about the confidential, having someone confidential be able to, where some staff can come and talk confidentially. We're also going to talk about debriefings and the power of debriefing and the power of how it is that we try to create some closure. So what's really fascinating about today's research is with the onset of the MRIs, we actually now know what the brain does and how the brain does it. And there's something called functional MRIs, which is where actually you see over time, you actually see it in motion. The brain changes based on what's happening when somebody's in an MRI. I'm going to talk about the three parts of the brain. And I want us to talk a little bit about, first, the reptilian part of the brain. The reptilian part of the brain is we know many animals that do this. It's just the survival part of the brain. It's the oldest part of our brain, and it's just that part of our brain that says, you know what? Think about this. Think of a coyote, and all of a sudden there's something else there that the coyote is scared of. What's the coyote going to do? Either they're going to flee or they're going to fight, right? Fight or flight. That's the reptilian part of our brain. But it's the action that's taken. Now, we have the second part of another part of our brain, which is called the midbrain. The midbrain is actually the limbic system. The limbic system is that part of our brain that feels everything. Not necessarily accurately, by the way, but that's where all the trauma gets stored. Everything that's happened to us, we don't even remember. We don't even have words for it, but that's where it gets stored. And it gets stored in a way that, depending on our age, depends on its sophistication. And that's why there's sometimes not words for it, because it depends on the sophistication of our age and of our own capability of abstract reasoning on how it gets stored. And then there's our neocortex. Our neocortex is actually our prefrontal lobe, and our prefrontal lobes are where it is that we mediate all of these emotional responses. If we have a strong prefrontal lobe neocortex process. And that's where we have our rational sense, our logic sits there, our sense of peace and our desire to keep growing and learning more, our desire to understand things. It's where our wisdom actually is. But it's in our neocortex. It's the newest part, by the way, of the human brain. If we take a look at what happens when there's a traumatic event, where do you think it hits first? Actually, you know what? The belief is that it actually hits the midbrain first and then swips right into the reptilian brain. So it actually hits them both. You have to have the reaction in order to get the desire to move. But you're right, the reptilian brain gets hit. So you've got the reptilian brain that's going to immediately want to do something, right? Well, in today's society, we can't just go out and Well, not that we're not sometimes tempted, right? Scream and yell or beat somebody or do something. I hope none of you are doing that. You're still not in jail, so I'm assuming most of you don't. I'll give you a great example. So my youngest daughter, we adopted from an orphanage in Siberia, Russia, when she was almost 2. So you can imagine what the first 2 years were like. Nothingness is an overstatement, is an understatement of what she went through. It was just terrible. I was there, and it was terrible. And she came home, and she was actually, I don't know if you've ever heard of this, psychosocial dwarfism. She was dwarfed. Her legs were much smaller than the rest of her body, and a little organic food and a lot of love. She grew 12 inches in 1 year. 12 inches in 1 year. My baby is now 13, and totally typical. But her early days with us, and as she was getting older and starting to move from Russian to English and starting to have words, her reptilian brain and her limbic system was so dysregulated that on a good day you would know that my entire belly would be filled with welts as a result of her beating me. And she was much stronger than she should have been at 3 years old and at 2 years old and at 4 years old. Much stronger. If we talk about it now, she's so, because her neocortex has, by the way, kicked in, she's so apologetic. She can't imagine that she would have hurt me. She just can't imagine it. But she doesn't remember most of it. But it was years where we would hold her while her limbic system and her reptilian brain was going wild. And I sometimes was stupid enough to hold her in the front rather than the back. I learned eventually you stand like this and you let them kick their legs. But I wasn't always, I'm little, I wasn't always successful. And she would rage until she would start to cry. And once she would start to cry, I could hold her and we would tell her how much we loved her and it was going to get better, it was going to get better, it was going to get better. And the interesting thing is all of these years, if you look at her now, she has such regulation over her limbic system. My son, who's older, used to call her Amy for the amygdala. He would call her Amy. It was so mean. It's like, oh, your Amy is on. It's like, oh, please be quiet, Sean. But you know, because I hate being called Amy. And of course, then it would kick off the amygdala, right, and the limbic system, and we would be back around again. That's what happens when you have a 7-year-old a brother that's 7 years older. But what's fascinating is to actually watch it in real time. And some of you have seen it. You've seen it with your own children. You've seen it with some of the children that you've worked with. You've seen it in yourself, probably, where you've had issues that just push buttons. And then suddenly one day, it doesn't push buttons anymore. And you're not sure why it's not pushing the same buttons. So what happens neurobiologically is that when there's been a traumatic event, when something trauma gets kicked off, even as secondary trauma, what happens is that the neocortex goes offline. We can't call it up anymore. We can't use it because everything is about the event. Everything is about how horrible we feel. It's about the emotion. But the interesting piece about this is that there's something called top-down management that really addresses the whole issue. And it's about getting the neocortex back online. How do we do that? How do we do it organizationally? How do we get people feeling less traumatized after an incident? And how do we do it personally? And how do we help staff do it? Well, of course, we know with research today that the neuroplasticity, we are able to grow and add brain cells and add neural connections for the rest of our lives. I just think that's the coolest thing. Did any of you get educated where after 5 you were like all done? Did anybody, are you guys old, anybody old enough in the room to remember after 5? I don't know who said it, but it's like, really, it seems so stupid when I think about it now. But that's how I was trained early on. So now what we need to do is actually putting the limbic back online. And this is what I'm saying to you, is that right now we're talking about individual staff, because you're going to see some of your staff very disorganized after an incident, and you're not necessarily going to know why. You're not going to know whether it pops off some previous trauma for them, because perhaps they haven't shared it. You're not going to know why, but I do want you to understand what's probably going on with them psychologically and neurologically. So part of getting it back online, and what we call just building new neural pathways, is recognizing that the limbic alarm has sounded. People need to be aware of it. They need to have some sort of level of internal analysis. They need to be able to know what's getting triggered from the past, and they need to be able to acknowledge the trauma and its effects. And most importantly, they need to be able to revise self-talk. Now, what happens specifically as leaders to help in this? And this is where the issues go in terms of really helping. part of helping for you on your side is making sure that you're able to get all the facts for people. One of the problems with critical incidences is that a lot of times what people really know is not necessarily what really happened. Agreed? So people are wanting to understand. What the research shows, which is fascinating, is that everybody needs a narrative. We need a story, a cohesive story. It has to be rational. It has to be logical. But it has to be cohesive. A couple years ago, we had an incident, a tragic incident. I can't even tell you how horrible it was, but the police, the first responders were a mess afterwards, and so were the physicians on campus who had treated this person who had made a very terrible choice on how to take his life. Interestingly, the first responders, they were traumatized, but they were okay. The physicians, as second responders, were a mess. They were a mess. And I didn't know what to do with them because, anybody a physician out here before I make this statement? Sometimes they're not as open as they could be. You know what I mean? Physicians are not as open. Is that an accurate statement? Okay, so I'm trying to be really nice and politically correct here. But they were calling me, there were several of them calling me saying, we don't know what to do, we don't know what to do. One was thinking about going out on disability as a result of this incident. So finally I said to them, you know what? And they talked to me about what it is that they didn't know. And finally I said to them, you know, and you can do this on Davis, I'm going to go head over to the police chief, and I want to know what's in the investigation. They can't ask, but I could. I went in and I sat for 2 hours with police chief and the investigator, and I went through all of the details about this individual. Why? What was it that he chose to do what he did? Why did he choose to do what he did? Specifically, he set himself on fire. Why would somebody do this? So, as I did the research and I'm starting to learn the information, I was amazed. And doctors were saying, what did we miss? What did we miss? Psychiatry, what did I miss? What did I miss? We treated him for years. What did we miss? Truth was that they didn't miss anything. But what they didn't know is that there were thousands of pictures on his computer of fire engines. And he was a wannabe firefighter. And he wanted to die in his passionate way. And they had no idea. And when I went in and I talked to the physician, I say, this is what we found. This is what the police have found. This is what we've concluded. You could have thought, I swear, if they could have, they didn't even offer to buy me lunch, come to think of it. But they could have, because they were so relieved that the story itself became more cohesive. We were putting together pieces to the puzzle. And I really want you to hear this when you're working with your staff and they're telling you that they're not getting it, they don't understand why something happened. What did they miss? They might not have missed anything. What they might have not known are pieces of the puzzle that they would not have been privy to. And if we can find out some of the pieces to the puzzle, we will see people go right back to getting psychologically organized again. We need a clear story and narrative in order to become organized again. Does that make sense? And think about it in your own life. In your own life, I'm sure it's happened, certainly happened in my life, where I start doing my research to find out what happened. What happened here? I want to know from the beginning to end what happened. Sometimes we can know, sometimes we can't. When we can't, it stays a bit unresolved. That doesn't mean we can't find other ways to resolve it. When we are looking at this top-down management, getting the neocortex back online, that's what it's called, we need to start talking about whether or not a threat that we're feeling internally is actually real or imagined. Usually it's just imagined, but it feels real. We need to talk about whether or not some people I recommend actually just to do the news fast when the news is bothering them. You know what a news fast is? It's where you stop looking at the news. You stop reading it. Anybody ever done a news fast? Is it not like the most wonderful? Do you get a little hopeful about the world after a while? Yeah? Don't you? I know. You get a little hopeful. It's like, wait, maybe it isn't as bad as I thought. And then you watch it again and you go, no, I was wrong. It's as bad. Right? But a news fast is very powerful during these kinds of times because it's very unhealthy to keep dousing ourselves and for your staff to keep dousing themselves with vitriol when they're already down. And it's something that you can certainly suggest, not that some people just can't help themselves, though, especially with the internet today. There's one other piece, and that is that helps people greatly get more organized psychologically, get their neocortex back online. And believe it or not, that's meditation. The research shows this. My job is so dark that you know what I do for the light? I teach meditation. I've taught almost 2,500 people here on campus how to meditate. And I do it, I would love to say I do it because I love it, but it's not true. I do it because my job was so dark that I needed to go to the light side, and I find that that's kind of the light side. And the interesting thing is the research shows this, is that meditation specifically will kick back in the neocortex. Now, I'm not going to bore you to go into the whole neurobiology of that, but I could. And if I'm invited back some other time, I'll do that. But the research has shown that. So it's one way. And the nice part about it is you don't even have to talk. You just close your eyes, and you breathe a little bit. So I want to talk about leadership, and I want to talk about what you can do. There's a direct correlation between administration support and organizational healing. I'm sure you're not at all surprised. An old saying that I love is that organizational trust is built one transparency at a time. This is a hard one because as leaders, how much are we allowed to say? And how much can't we say? And sometimes there's things we're not allowed to say. Agreed? And yet saying them would probably create great amounts of relief for staff. Have you been in this bind before? Because I'm in this bind a lot. It would be greatly relieving. And I really try to pick and choose what it is I'm going to say, and I like to weigh out what's the most important thing here. What is the most important thing? Administrative support is absolutely imperative. And some people, when I go out into organizations, because I work in many of the departments here on campus, and I'm called for these examples when there's stuff that's happened in one of the departments, is how do I actually, for some leaders, explain to them how it is that they even can be transparent? Because it's hard sometimes. It's a fine line. It's a very fine line to run. So I'm going to say this again, though. If you're going to stabilize an organization, you have to respond to individual staff needs. Now, sometimes that is more transparency. Sometimes that looks like the fact-finding we were talking about earlier. You being the one that's able to come to them and say, I'm going to tell you what really happened. Let us talk about what really happened here. I want you to be able to build a cohesive story here, not one that you guys are trying to take from the news or trying to talk to each other about and trying to figure it out. I want you guys to know what happened. Also, as leaders, there needs to be regular education about secondary trauma. It's there, it's alive, and you guys are so busy that it's not discussed enough. And yet, it's one of the biggest reasons why there's so much turnover in social services. It needs to be addressed. Group debriefings are absolutely very, very important, and I'll talk to you about why that is in a little bit. I'm also a big believer in manager-supervisor individual debriefings. Now, that can be incredibly uncomfortable for managers and leaders. It's uncomfortable because you can't predict what people are going to ask you. Nonetheless, there's nothing probably more powerful for staff when you sit down as a leader and say, are you okay? Do we need to talk? Is there anything that I can do? I know you're probably wreaking havoc here. Is there anything that I might be able to help you with? And of course, there's some things you can and there's some things you can't. But the fact that you ask is so incredibly empowering that it will already reduce some of the trauma. And it builds organizational trust. It's a very powerful piece that and if you have to think about it, because the problem is it can't just be with that, let's say that social worker that, let's say if a child was harmed, that social worker. It has to be with those people that you believe are actually very greatly affected. And that doesn't necessarily mean just the social worker or social workers that work directly with the case. It's very important, as well as leaders, to identify who's struggling. Somebody mentioned the Employees Assistance Program earlier. If you don't, in your county, work with or know very intimately your Employees Assistance Program, I invite you to call the director of that program and meet them. They could end up being your best friend, and they could end up dealing with some of the stuff that is so difficult to deal with that you will be very relieved when they deal with it instead. So Employees Assistance Programs are fascinating. Again, UC Davis has an internal one, but many are external. My office in LA, we were an external Employees Assistance Program, and we would go out and talk to people all the time and help agencies and help corporations. Obviously, we need empathy, so I'm not going to talk more about that because you poor people are probably already have too much. And there needs to be realistic expectations. And that's something that's very important to be able to say actually to staff is what's realistic in terms of what the agency needs, what the agency can get? How many of you have had staff say, we just need this and everything will be fine? And you're like, we don't have the money for that. I mean, that's what you want to say. I'm not saying you say that, but, right? Or we can't do that. I mean, some people have really wacky ideas, don't they, about what will fix things? Right? But you want to look empathic and thank you, and I'll take that into consideration. You know, you guys know that. I know you know that. You do that all the time, right? But it's true. So, but the point is still allowing people to say it is not a bad thing. Being able to set people's, being realistic about it, though, that's probably, I think it's a wonderful idea. I actually agree with you, and it'll never happen. And I agree with you, and it'll never happen. Very important to at least validate, because the truth is that if we were able, and you guys, let's say we tripled your budget. No, you don't triple, you need more than that? He's not even happy about tripling. You need more? Quadrupled? So if we quadrupled your budget, could you think of a lot of different things that you would do in your agency that would really probably greatly impact the children, greatly impact the staff, greatly impact the organization? Yeah, well, it's not happening. So because it's not happening, right, you're still working within your own confines, unfortunately. Unfortunately. I want to move back to the power of debriefing for a moment. I've probably facilitated, maybe 350 to 400 debriefings over the years. Debriefings are very interesting. I was trained in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. Probably some of you guys may not know. Remember the CISD, Critical Incident Stress Debriefing, when it became popular in the 80s? A guy named Jeffrey Mitchell created it. Jeffrey Mitchell later was discredited because some of his ideas about debriefing actually were not the best. But he actually trained me in critical incident debriefing when I worked at the LA County Sheriff's Department. And what I've done is taken what I believe are some of the strongest components of it and wiped out some of the other stuff that they found there wasn't efficacy when they started to research. One thing that was not efficacious, actually, interestingly, that they found was, it was when do you do the debriefing? Many people thought that you do a debriefing right after an incident. That's the best time you do a debriefing. And actually it's found not to be true. So here on campus, we wait 2 to 3 days before we do a debriefing. Any thoughts about why? To wait 2 or 3 days? Let it settle. Move out of. You get more information. Yes, there is more information already that people have. You get the facts, yes. And I love when I'm doing a debriefing to be briefed on the facts, by the way. I like to talk facts because I'm happy to build people's narrative and story. I don't mind. But I need the facts. Anybody else? Any thoughts about why it would be that you wait a few days before you do a debriefing? Yes?
You slip that down in the reptilian, you got to come back up to mid-brain.
Thank you. Absolutely. So what happens is that how many of you have ever, after someone has passed, let's say, maybe a family member, and you've seen them in shock and denial? Shock and denial. Very hard to make any room. You're right. They're in the reptilian and they're in their limbic. You can't really reach them, right? I mean, it's not that you can't support them, but there's really not a lot to say when people are in shock and denial. If you're ever with a family member who's there, listen. Just listen and say, I love you. I'm really sorry you're having a hard time, because there's not a lot to say because they're in shock and denial. But you're right. When they start to move out, and we find this within 2 to 3 days. So one thing I'm very careful about, and be careful if you have somebody run in the first day, it's probably not that effective. It's not as effective as it could be. What happens in debriefings is that, and it's good, by the way, to have a debriefer who is from the outside. And what happens in debriefings is actually, it's really important for the debriefer, the facilitator, to be a witness, to just be a witness to what happened. You'd be amazed at how much people need witnesses. And just about hearing the story, and that's the way we'll start with, can you tell us the story? And then sometimes we'll have other facts that we can add to it. And so what do you think about, oh, yes, and that, and it becomes a very, very deep discussion for some. Now, some people don't talk at all. And don't ever be concerned about the people in the room that don't talk at all, because they get a lot out of the debriefings just by listening. So there's never a mandatory. In the old Jeffrey Mitchell model, everybody had to talk. Well, how do the introverts like that, huh, guys? Everybody has to talk in a crowd. Oh, boy, that went over big. No more. They don't do that. I don't do that in my debriefings. We let people, whoever they want to talk, who's not, be quiet. A lot of times they're the ones that come up afterwards. They'll want to talk privately. They'll want to come into our office and have a session. And there's no judgment about it. Debriefings are powerful too because a clinician, the facilitator, gets to start to know who is struggling, who's having trouble, who needs more closure. They can flag that for management. It's very important. Also, it's very important in terms of education-wise. It's important because we want to make sure that people don't get freaked out. People get freaked out when they have emotional responses that they can't predict. Would you agree? We love to be able to predict, even though we can't. We all kind of know it. Our neocortex knows it, right? We can't really predict the future. But we like to be able to. So what the best facilitators do is they will predict for people how they might feel. Tomorrow, a week from now, even a month from now, what it looks like if you're unresolved. Don't be surprised if you can't be productive at work. I'm going to tell your boss that you won't be productive at work. Not for a while. Very, very validating. And also, it doesn't freak them out when it happens because then they go, oh, wait a minute, I think that facilitator said that I am going to feel like crap. Oh, yeah, and I feel like crap. Okay, at least I know I'm not like going crazy, I'm not offline. And these are just some of the details about debriefings. I said choose an outside facilitator. You always must decide whether or not a debriefing is voluntary or mandatory. I go back and forth with this depending on the incident. I really assess the incident to decide, and I will decide with management whether or not, when we're doing them, whether or not it would be imperative to be mandatory. For example, with firefighters, we always make them mandatory with firefighters. And sometimes they don't like it, but we make them mandatory with firefighters. We will make them mandatory here on campus with police as well. Importance of timing, 3 days, 2 to 3 days, even up to 5 you can go before somebody comes out. I'm a believer that we want to revisit. You go a month or two later. You might even want to go when everything starts hitting the fan and we start seeing maybe there's more news media again, maybe there's been a perpetrator that's been caught and there's now going to be a court case. Debriefing again if you notice stuff comes up. Debriefing is your friend. It's your friend. I think one thing about being realistic, and you might have noticed how pragmatic I am at this point, would you agree that the reality is that it's not if, it's when you guys are going to have another traumatic event? Are your staff aware of that, do you think? Think they realize it? Do you think that some people hope that that was the last one, it's not going to happen again? So what I make sure to do as a leader, and we certainly do this on campus, is that I'm a very pragmatic leader. I like to say it is not if, it's when for certain incidences. I can tell you, sadly, that's going to happen in terms of violence on campus, on most campuses today, and it's going to happen eventually on our campus. We've come too close. I know, we've just gotten too close. So those of us that are professional threat assessors here on campus, that's our mantra. It's not if, and it's when, and we try to educate people about that. We need to make sure that we're ready because it's not if, it's when. We need to grow from this and learn from this. So that is a reality, but there's another reality too, and that is that some people forget what they're actually, not why they went to do what they're doing, but the fact that they're in social services, and these things happen for a reason because that's why we call them social service cases, right? These cases wouldn't be coming onto your desk, would they, if the people that you were working with were healthy. They wouldn't be coming onto your desk if there weren't some problems that were difficult and problematic enough that would get you involved. Am I correct? They're dark cases usually. And I think sometimes you have to understand that staff forget that because they're in the trenches and they're working with the cases and they're trying to help and they're trying to make headway and they hope they make headway and then they notice there's a slide back, but then they make headway again. But please don't assume that staff remember this. So at the risk of sounding dark, this is a very important message to give your staff. And you're right, the young staff are just so excited and they've got a lot of energy, and I love bringing new staff in. We run a doctoral training program. I bring 4 new staff in every year. We pump out young psychologists, and they're excited and they're everything, and they've got all that motivation. And I feel like I'm the naysayer, but I start to talk about reality right away. Because the first incident that they're running out to, they're going, oh my goodness, I never thought this would happen at this job. The goal actually is what we call post-traumatic growth. Post-traumatic growth has been an interesting piece because post-traumatic growth actually is where you're able to take the narrative we were talking about and you actually learn from it. So what's happened with the research around secondary trauma is the need to start to look for post-traumatic growth. And what does that mean? It means it's about resilience. It's about resilience and being able to grow from these incidences organizationally, being able to grow individually from these incidences. How many of you know anybody or yourself where something really horrible happened in your life and you're actually kind of better for it? Like you, I don't know, it maybe changed your perspective. When I was 36, I almost died from a very terrible disease that I now manage much better. But I think they would say I was through hell and back is what they call it because they didn't know if I would make it. And I have to tell you, coming back out and functioning again, I'm happy just to wake up in the morning and I'm walking because I used to be in a wheelchair. I mean, to me, it's like, wow, I'm good. My day is already 10 steps ahead just because I was able to get out of bed. But I decided during all the years of harrowing illness and how it stunk that if I wasn't going to make something good at it and I wasn't going to find some gift at it, then this pain could not have been worth it. And I'm going to say the same thing for you, that post-traumatic growth is a newer term that is gaining more popularity. And what it is we can't stop the traumas, but we can grow from them. And it's our responsibility to figure out how we can also help staff grow from them. So here's my theory. And you might be coming to see me at my ice cream shop soon. Because either your staff need to build resilience, or they ought to go out and change their jobs and go buy an ice cream shop where everybody is happy the minute, right? They're all happy, they're smiling because they have their ice cream, right? They leave, they thank you, and nothing is that dark when people are eating ice cream. Or I'm not that dark, but I'm eating ice cream. So I say that because this is quite a common statement that we make here in our Employees Assistance Program. If this job doesn't fit for you and it's making you sick, and we'll say this to staff all the time, the environment isn't a good environment for you, please choose something else. Because the environment probably isn't going to change all that much. The work probably isn't going to change all that much. And some people are okay working on this side of where we work, but other people need the cabaret. They just don't do well. And I really like to support people who might want to find jobs that involve the cabaret. And in my retirement, I'm planning on the cabaret because I want to offset 30-some years of not being in the cabaret. Does that make sense? So start fantasizing about what you want to do. I already know. And it involves Pacific Coast Highway down in Orange County because I own a house in Dana Point. And maybe one day you'll come by and you'll go, wait a minute, I know you. And you'll smile when you leave. You'll smile when you leave. Thank you so much.
Terrific presentation.